You're pretty good. Just what I'd expect from the man with the same code as the boss.
In video games today, it's very common for games to be compared to movies. With studios like Naughty Dog, Ubisoft, and PlayStation Studios continuously pushing the boundaries and making bigger and larger cinematic-like experiences, the lines between movies and video games are getting blurrier. But if there was one man in one video game series that helped to show the movie-like power of video games, it's Hideo Kojima and Metal Gear Solid. At a time when games were still primarily seen as just toys and simple distractions, Metal Gear Solid helped to show that games could tackle tough themes with emotion, action, and a lot of heart. Hi, my name is Jay, and these are the Gaming Essentials. With the release of Metal Gear Solid Delta in the next few months, I'll be going through the first 3 Metal Gear Solid titles, explaining just how important these games are. For me, Metal Gear was always a name that was thrown around when I was growing up, but I could never actually get into it, as the series had already peaked when I was just a kid. And when I had actually grown up and was able to appreciate the games for what they are, the series was already so expansive that it was tough to break through all of the lore. Even then, however, it's clear how the series is different. Metal Gear Solid puts a bigger emphasis on cutscenes and on sneaking around compared to other games. The story is filled with dozens of twists and turns that are befitting of an espionage adventure. There are plenty of heart-pounding bosses that elevate the tension and the suspense, and it has a number of secrets, fourth wall breaking moments, and meta commentary that are still relevant today. There's a reason why Metal Gear Solid is experiencing a resurgence even after all of these years. Part of that reason is because of Hideo Kojima and his vision of creating cinematic experiences that can only be found in video games. No matter if you've been following this series since the 90s or have never played a Metal Gear Solid game, join me as I talk about why Metal Gear Solid 1 is one of the most influential games of all time. In the mid to late 90s, video games were still a relatively niche hobby, considered to be just toys or playthings primarily for young boys. But as games developed in maturity, more and more developers are seeking to tell heart-pounding, emotionally powerful and moving stories that went beyond just simple novelty. Much like how the movie industry began to move away from Nickelodeons and simple novelty reels in the mid to late 1920s, the video game industry also began to understand the potential of games in the late 90s. With games like Resident Evil 2, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, and Final Fantasy VII, developers realized they could tell engaging stories that were on the same level as movies. And that's where Metal Gear Solid comes in. Written and directed by Hideo Kojima, Kojima was, and still is, heavily inspired by the movies and books of his youth. And that comes off very clearly, especially in the main character of Snake, named after and resembling the character of Snake Plissken from Escape from New York. Even the game's Colonel bears a strikingly similar resemblance to Richard Crenna's Colonel from the Rambo series. And the villain Revolver Ocelot is a clear nod to the spaghetti westerns of old. Hideo Kojima has always been vocal about how his surrounding books, movies, and other video games have inspired him. In his book, The Creative Gene, Kojima talks about memes. No, not the internet funny GIF memes, but the anthropologic idea of how cultures, ideas, customs, and values are passed down through stories. As stories are passed from one generation to another, and as they are written and read, culture is carried forward. Like genes are passed on through a connection between one person and another, memes are passed on through a connection between a person and a book or a film. This idea of passing on one's genes, teachings, and philosophies from one generation to another is heavily present in Metal Gear Solid. And the game itself is also Hideo Kojima's way of passing on his culture, values, and beliefs to the next generation. And you can see that clearly in Metal Gear Solid, from the naming and design of the characters, even down to the game's music direction. Nowadays, as the director and head of Kojima Productions, Kojima is still making movie-like experiences with games like Death Stranding. While his games are known to be bizarre, filled with long cutscenes, but also extremely visionary, here in Metal Gear Solid 1, Kojima's personality is more subtle. And that's a good thing, as his future titles can be off-putting, with babies stuck in characters' throats, and with all of this talk of beaches. Here in Metal Gear Solid 1, the game is still weird and bizarre for sure, but it's much more palatable, and isn't overly serious, but also isn't overtly strange.
I will show you my psychokinetic power. Put your controller on the floor. Put it down as flat as you can. That's good. Now I will move your controller by the power of my will alone.
The game centers around Solid Snake, a famed stealth operative tasked with infiltrating a military compound called Shadow Moses in a remote region of Alaska. The base has been taken captive by Snake's old military unit called Foxhound. Foxhound is comprised of members like Revolver Ocelot, Sniper Wolf, Psycho Mantis, and Liquid Snake, all memorable characters who I'll get to in a moment. It's up to Solid Snake to infiltrate the Shadow Moses base and eliminate Foxhound before they can use a high-tech nuclear weapon called Metal Gear. The story is much more complex than this, with many revelations and in-depth character backgrounds, but at the heart of the story is a message about war and its dehumanizing effects on those in it. Throughout the game, Snake is called a legend by all those who encounter him.
It's an honor to speak to a living legend like yourself.
But it's a title that he disdains. Even though he's a character capable of great military feats, his scars weigh heavy on him. And that comes through most of all in the game's supporting characters.
Ever since I was a little girl, I always dreamed about being a soldier. Every day of my life, I've trained my mind and body for the one day when I could finally see some real action. And now...
So what now? You want to quit?
I can't quit. I can't allow myself to quit now.
Listen, Meryl. Everybody feels sick the first time they kill someone. Unfortunately, killing is one of those things that gets easier the more you do it. In a war, all of mankind's worst emotions, worst traits come out. It's easy to forget what a sin is in the middle of a battlefield.
Snake is the game's main character, but it's the game's supporting cast of characters that take the spotlight and show how there's no glory in battle. Take, for example, Meryl, Snake's female ally looking to make a name for herself and show her capabilities in battle. Even though she's green around the ears, is eager to impress and wants to show her male counterparts she's just as strong as they are, it's Snake who tries to protect her and show her the truth. There's nothing glorious about killing, and combat doesn't care about your gender, only whether or not you live or die.
This isn't a training exercise. Our lives are riding on this. There are no heroes or heroines. If you lose, you're worm food.
Yeah.
Or take the character of Otacon. He's a geeky, timid, and sometimes inept individual. And when he's introduced, he's seen soiling himself as he's confronted with one of the game's many dangerous bosses. It shows how Otacon is completely inexperienced in dangerous situations. And over the game's story, he begins to get disheartened as he struggles to find a reason to move on amidst all the deaths he's seen. But it's Snake who encourages him to push on and not lose hope, even amidst the suffering.
Snake! What was she fighting for? What am I fighting for? What are you fighting for?
If we make it through this, I'll tell you.
All of this is there to reinforce the game's main theme about the futility of nuclear proliferation. Even though this is very much a game where stealth and shooting guns and missiles are the main parts, it's also an anti-war work of art. Released in the near aftermath of the Cold War, Metal Gear Solid tackled this theme at a time when the game industry, let alone much of the entertainment industry, wasn't. And it's even more evidence of how trailblazing, but also how refreshing Metal Gear Solid 1 is, even in today's gaming landscape. Let's talk about the gameplay of Metal Gear Solid. The series is known for being one of, if not the founding pillar behind the stealth action genre, helping to pave the way for games like Splinter Cell, Thief, and Deus Ex. Rather than going guns blazing, the game rewards patience, careful study of enemy patterns and environments, and outsmarting enemies. But on my first playthrough, that wasn't what surprised me the most. Stealth action, traversal, and sneaking around enemies will be refined in the later games. But for me, what stood out the most in Metal Gear Solid was how many bosses there are, and how many amazing set pieces are in this game. Many memorable bosses like Cyborg Ninja, Liquid Snake in the helicopter, or Sniper Wolf all make for amazing movie-like moments. It feels like a Soulsborne game, with how many bosses there are, and they all have their secrets and strategies that players must figure out to defeat them. I won't give away any of these bosses' secrets for those who have never played it yet, but these bosses required me to think outside of the game's own rules. Each one of them features heartbreaking backstories that gives you, the player, a better understanding of who they are. In a way, you regret having to kill some of these bosses, as you come to empathize and feel for them. While a lot of people talk about how Shadow of the Colossus was one of the earliest games to make the player feel bad for their actions, Metal Gear Solid did first.
I was born on the battlefield, raised on the battlefield. Gunfire, sirens, and screams. They were my lullabies. Hunted like dogs, day after day, driven from our ragged shelters. That was my life.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the game's cutscenes. Metal Gear Solid wasn't the first video game with cinematics. Games like Final Fantasy VII and Resident Evil 2 came out only a few months before. However, I think Metal Gear Solid was the first game that perfected video game cutscenes. The game features a fully voice-acted cast and elaborate character movements and gestures, something Final Fantasy VII didn't have. And while Resident Evil 2 features CG cutscenes, Metal Gear Solid features real-time in-engine cutscenes, meaning the same models and environments when the player is in control are also the same models and environments when the player is sitting back enjoying the story. And these are long, sometimes 10-minute long cutscenes with a lot of dialogue and exposition. This has always been a point of contention among gamers, as some criticize these scenes for going on for too long, hoping to get back in the action. But I think there's something special about this. It's practically a trademark of Hideo Kojima, where he creates long cutscenes that explain expansive backgrounds. While some of this information may be cursory to some gamers, I think it sets the pace, providing a slow burn that makes the bigger moments of action all the more explosive. 26 years later, the video game industry still owes a massive debt to Hideo Kojima and Metal Gear Solid. If you're a fan of games like The Last of Us, Mass Effect, or even Call of Duty, you have Metal Gear Solid to thank for helping to pave the way for cinematic storytelling in video games. With movie-like quality cutscenes, classic espionage action, Metal Gear Solid leaves a lasting impression on longtime fans and people like me who are just getting into it for the first time. It's an impression that shows that video games' best is yet to come. Some aspects of Metal Gear Solid do show their age. The game's controls can be at times pretty unwieldy, and the game's bosses can be very unfair, pulling out cheap tricks and maneuvers that do large chunks of damage. But there's also a lot here that still holds up. From the game's twisting and winding plot, and the beautiful and striking soundtrack, to the iconic characters that even made their way into Super Smash Bros., there's a reason why the game is considered to be legendary. As gaming media continually evolves and gets older and older, I want to acknowledge and remember how we got here and appreciate what's come before. And gaming wouldn't be where it is today without Metal Gear Solid, which is why Metal Gear Solid 1 is a gaming essential. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribe, as I'll be going through more Metal Gear Solid titles in the next few weeks. New videos pop up every week, so come back soon for even more on the best that video games have to offer.